Hello and welcome to Meet the Music. I am your host, Thomas Corley. Thank you for listening and joining our musical journey. In our previous seasons, we explored a number of music genres that were heavily influenced by Black musicians, like the blues, jazz, and R&B. This episode, we are going to introduce something that is not commonly known by music listeners. This episode will feature a conversation/education on the Black music influences in the rock and roll music genre. Joining me for insight is Denise Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan is an American music journalist, historian, and author. She is a contributor and writer for San Francisco Examiner, San Francisco Chronicle, Downbeat, Tourworthy, and Current San Francisco. She has contributed to many books, magazines, and web sources, from the San Francisco Chronicle and All the Music Guide to the Rolling Stone. Her books include The White Stripes, a local band from Detroit, Sweethearts of the Blues, REM, Talk About the Passion, Rip It Up, Rock and Roll, Rule Breakers, Shamans, Blues, the art and influences behind Jim Morrison and the Doors, and Keep It On Pushing, Black Power music from the blues to hip hop, all of which may possibly be reference points in our conversation. Here's a quote from Pop Matters. Denise Sullivan represents the insider intellectual stamina of rock and roll journalism without the pomp and pretense. She is the past and future of the form rolled into one uncanny style. Denise Sullivan, welcome to Meet the Music.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm really honored and glad to be here with you today.
Thank you for your time. So let's just start from the beginning. What was your soundtrack in your youth and kind of what your soundtrack was in your college days?
Wow. Well, from as early as I can remember, music was part of my household. Not that my parents played particularly, but they were real enthusiasts, with the stereo and records. And I think pertinent to your broadcast, all types of music were represented in the household. My dad was a super jazz fan and had gone to see live jazz in San Francisco kind of in its heyday in the 50s and 60s. And my mom liked anything that was popular on the radio, show tunes and vocals and opera. And so all of this was kind of swirling around. And of course, this was a time when radio was still a very powerful force in the culture. In fact, I would say radio and television were the dominant media at the time, and it was always on. So as a child of that time, we would joke that the television was the babysitter, or the radio and the record player became kind of my pastime, really. So when I say all types of music, I really do mean all types of music. But that said, we all love the music of our time. So in the late 60s, early 70s, this kind of music with a message really caught my ear because that was what was happening at the time. And a lot of groups, whether they were rock or soul or folk, right, they were dealing in the topical subject matter of the time. So you asked me, I've already taken a few, off side roads here, but you asked me what was my kind of music. Well, of course, I loved what was on the radio and what was on TV. And at that time, it was groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And it was also these variety shows, like, I don't know if you would remember, but certainly anyone who grew up in my time would remember this tradition of like the Ed Sullivan Show, or
Right.
the Smothers Brothers comedy hour, Flip Wilson.
Yeah.
Everybody had crazy musical guests. So you could see the Doors, for example. You could see, the Isley Brothers. You could see, it was just crazy. We were bombarded with great music all the time. So that was formative for me. And I can safely say that I carried that forward with me. And then, of course, I would go backward in time. By the time I got to college and it was kind of hip hop and punk rock and, all that was kind of in the mix. We were starting to reach back in time because some of our favorite groups, whether, it was Grandmaster Flash or The Clash, who, by the way, worked together. And that's a very formative experience for me when I saw Grandmaster Flash and The Clash together sharing the stage. But they would tell us, hey, look, you have to go back and listen to X, Y, and Z. And The Clash would say, bring Bo Diddley on tour with them or Lee Dorsey. So suddenly I'm introduced into a world of music that predates my existence, but I'm very, very interested in it. So that's how it works for me, a kind of timeline, backward, forward, back. And I don't discriminate along lines of musical categories at all, because that it just comes very naturally to me. The charts and television itself was integrated, for lack of a better word. In fact, rock and roll was a response, a rejection of segregation. So that takes us right, back to the birth of rock and roll, which we may or may not talk about. But I think that I always took that for granted. Now, decades have passed, and that history has kind of fallen away. There's so many more artists out there in the world that we all have to catch up on and keep up on. So how could we possibly know this deep history of rock and roll, which
Right.
of course predates rock and roll, goes back to the blues and gospel, and the tribal drumming of indigenous America. Also takes in Cuba and the coast of Africa. So you see, it's all a hybrid thing, and it's not as simple as the blues had a baby and named it rock and roll, like Muddy Waters said.
Right.
Or it's not just blues and country and gospel, it's all that other stuff. And to me, you could probably tell the way I'm rushing through this, it's very exciting. I'm passionate about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. But I want to roll back for a second. So in your youth, were you unique in your listening habits among your friends?
That's funny. You should ask. Yeah, I guess I was, and I don't think about that much. And it was interesting. The person that would try to get other people excited about a certain music, right? I was the one who had the budget to go out and buy a single. In fact, I have friends that I've had my whole life, and they remember me making us ride the bikes to the Five and Dime so I could buy a 45 of something that was on the radio and then come back home and play it over and over and over and over again until, everyone was about to go crazy. That was who I was. It was part of my identity. And, it's funny for those of us who love and collect records and become kind of, gather this intimate knowledge about the music. Some would say it's a substitute for not having an art or musical ability ourselves. And that may well be true. But music, just the sound of music, just brought me a kind of joy that was indescribable. So it was my area, my place to go, my so-called safe place, an area of comfort and great joy for me. And so whether I was an outsider among my friends, which I kind of was in that regard, I had that place to go, and the music always supported me.
Yeah. My listeners have heard me say this before. Growing up in Detroit, we were fortunate enough to have, 4 of the major sport teams here. And so on Monday, after a weekend of sports, everybody would have these conversations about, what player did what in the course of the game. I was the guy who could tell you the popular DJs, what their set was, and what new song came out the night before or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, I'm unique like that also.
Well, I was just saying, it is kind of like sports fans. It is kind of about collecting stats, right?
Right.
The names and the dates and the places and yeah, even right down to the catalog numbers on the records and absurd things like that. I feel like it was a replacement of sorts for my ability to have emotions in real time, but in a way that kind of saved me, from the difficulties of growing up.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like you probably a little bit more, not a little bit more, you're probably a lot more into liner notes than I was.
Oh my gosh, I can feel it, just thinking about it. It's really sweet to go back and explore these memories because it's not something that I think about that much these days, but it's so fresh in my mind, that feeling of getting a new record
Mm-hmm.
and opening it up and putting it on and then sitting with
Right.
the album
Yeah.
and reading every word,
Right.
and just living with it. There were no other distractions in the room with you except the album itself. So
Right.
yeah, I would read the liner notes over and over, and I think now, I can't say this for sure, but I do think that it probably put the idea in my head that I would see, say, like on some of my parents' records, on the jazz records, and on the Columbia records that we're putting out, like the folk music and the kind of records by um, artists who now are kind of heritage artists, but at the time they were new and fresh, whatever it was, Olatunji, or uh, Nina Simone,
Mhm.
Odetta, these kinds of things. I would look and I would see, oh, well, somebody wrote about this in the New York Times, or, these names like Nat Hentoff or Ralph Gleason, and they're
Yes.
saying
Yes.
these things about these artists. I'd be like, huh, well, maybe there's room for me in that world to write on the backs of albums. I didn't know how you would do that, but it just seemed like a place where I could fit.
Right.
I think it planted a seed anyway.
Yeah. Well, in your bio, in many places I looked, whether it be Amazon or Wikipedia or your website, it mentioned that you were a DJ. At what stage in your life did you do a gig as a DJ?
Well, college radio,
Okay. Yeah, that's where
like a
everybody
lot of
starts.
us.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, college radio was a great opportunity, and then I was really interested. I feel foolish talking about this because I don't know why I feel foolish, but I do. I guess because I'm kind of a shy person, and I don't like to say I did this. It almost seems unbelievable. It kind of seems unbelievable to me, but I will just tell you
Please.
that um,
Don't hold back.
I really loved hip hop. At the birth of hip hop, the golden age of hip hop, as it's known, and so I started to acquire a lot of Sugar Hill records, 12-inch records,
Right.
because my friends were playing them, and some of them were DJs, and some of them knew how to beat mix because they had worked in discos. And I was, younger and just coming up, and I was curious, and so I asked a couple friends to to teach me how to spin records for the club, which is different than spinning records on the air for a college radio station.
All right.
And I was lucky enough to have a couple people show me how to do it. So, I did learn how to beat mix as a young woman, and I did play records in dance clubs at a time when, that was kind of unusual for a young woman to be doing, a young white woman actually, to be doing. I didn't excel at it. I was okay at it. But the point is that I tried it because I was such a fan, you know. I just love the music. And once again, we're going back to that idea that, it brought me so much joy. And the thing about beat mixing and DJing in general, as you know, is that you have to be in the moment. You cannot let your mind wander for a second. So if you're trying to match that beat, I mean, you are completely in full concentration mode before you let that record slip.
Right.
So I think I loved the intensity of the meditation, the Zen of mixing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I wished today, now, if I had it to do over again, I would have pursued the technical side and the production side further than I did after college. I basically got through college and avoided a lot of the hands-on stuff. I just did the bare minimum. I wish I had paid more attention because, of course, the technological revolution was coming, and I might have been better prepared.
Right.
But
So
that was then.
What was where did you grow up in your youth? What city did you?
In the San Francisco Bay
Bay Area.
Area.
Okay, in the Bay Area. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you are not, you know who Sly Stone is then.
Of course.
Okay.
I mean, as a child, it was like this idea that, a lot of my memories, they get, the sands of time, they tumble these things around, and some of it gets washed away and some of it, is crystal clear. But the point is, I think as a kid, I probably thought that the family stone was actually a family. And in some regard, they were. Of course, they were.
Mm-hmm.
But really, it was like this fantasy of mine was that a band and a family. I mean, that's like a dream come true. Okay, like I used to watch the Partridge Family.
Same here.
I used to, and oh my gosh, this. I don't know if you've seen the Summer of Soul, right?
Yeah, I did catch that.
The film,
Yes.
right? So I did not expect all these great artists of all time. I did not expect when the portion came on the Fifth Dimension that this is what would bring me to tears when I had a recollection of how much I loved the Fifth Dimension, that I would act out the songs much like they did with those stage moves, right?
Right.
The interpretive dance. Yeah. I mean, this idea that a band was together, partners in love and family, this was just something that I couldn't imagine. So to get back to Sly, well, this was a dream come true. Black, white, men, women, and the music is undeniable. And the message is all about love.
Right.
So what could be better?
Right.
I just, this is just something, the story of Sly Stone will probably haunt all of us till the end of time, because a massive talent, that walked among us, that brought innovation to the studio and to the stage, and this music that is everlasting. If I wanted to get across anything at all in this conversation, whether we're calling it rock and roll or rock and soul, which is a term that I love, which I picked up from the great singer Solomon Burke, who used it pretty persistently and consistently. Whether whatever kind of music we're talking about, great music transcends time and space and categorization, right?
Yes.
That is why Sly, you put that on for anybody and they're not going to be able to deny it. It's genius.
the college days, I mean, were you DJing? Were you able to have a free format, or were you guys restricted to play something different? I mean, genre-wise.
Oh no, definitely free format. So what would be great is that, as I said before, that contemporary groups would lead us back to the music of the 50s, and I would like to say earlier, but we weren't really. I would say that I didn't know too many of my contemporaries who were into like early recorded American music. And when I speak of that, I really mean blues and gospel in particular. But so we would play the music of the 50s and then the music of the 60s and 70s along with the music of the 80s. And it didn't seem unusual or strange. Some of us had grown up in that 70s era of FM underground radio where free format was kind of the thing, and we wanted to emulate that. And San Francisco certainly has a legacy of freeform radio, and we were trying to uphold that. So I could throw in something like Sly next to whatever,
Right.
we played a lot of Motown, we played a lot of ska, and we played a lot of reggae that went hand in hand with the modern rock. I mean, it was just danceable, really.
Oh, okay.
That was part of it. And it often had a message about unity, freedom, whatever was happening. I would say, we were in the anti-apartheid kind of that movement was really culminating,
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And so you had a lot of young rock bands kind of working for the anti-apartheid cause, and this could bring you back to the political music of the 60s and 70s with ease and grace. You could move in and out of those kinds of sounds, and not even really, this is kind of the interesting part, and not really even let the listener know that you were trying to send a message, because they were just nodding and dancing along, right?
Right. So you mentioned somewhat of an inspiration for you, the New York Times writers and their pieces that they did. What was the spark for you? Well, let me ask this question. Well, before you wrote your books, did you write papers or for? I mean, what did you write? I guess what did you write first that you remember that was
Well, yeah,
passionate for you?
what I remember first doing was compiling a music chart, a playlist for like a grade school newsletter. I don't remember a thing that was on it, but I do remember that somewhere around high school, I noticed that my high school paper had a music critic or columnist. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I made that leap. Oh, that's something that I could do. And so I started working for the high school paper, and I kind of quickly worked my way into that music columnist job, which and I had a lot of encouragement from my high school journalism teacher. And so again, like the records, the journalism room kind of became my hangout, and I picked up a lot of skills and knowledge about how to make a newspaper, and became an editor of the school paper, and pursued that in college. So it was all about media and production, broadcasting, and writing for me. So I continued to work on the college paper, and then I got a gig for a local music publication covering local music news. And it was, pretty typical entry level stuff. I did not. I did not get to pursue newspaper journalism until later in life. I went and worked other kinds of jobs, but I was in and around the music business. So in a way, I was picking up valuable insider information about the music business, which I could write a whole other book on, and we could have a whole other discussion on. But it's pertinent to my coverage today of what I think are underreported stories, the ways in which artists, songwriters, and often women and people of color have been historically mistreated by the music industry itself. This is what I learned from working inside music, and this is what I bring to my reporting today. So, all was not lost. All the experience was good and valuable, and again, I'm just as passionate about pursuing artistic, racial, creative, economic justice for folks as I am about listening listening to music of the ages.
Yeah. So can you go ahead and touch on the historical birth of rock and roll?
Sure. I mean, it's funny. Depending on who you talk to, rock and roll had a lot of different births, right? And we talked about the hybrid element of it's not just a new thing; it's many different things put together. But somewhere in the late 40s, it's generally agreed there. It could be earlier, it could be later, but by the late 40s, early 50s, this sound was kind of developing, and I thought, wouldn't it be neat if we started before 1950 and 1949 with John Lee Hooker, who, as you know, has a connection to Detroit and also has a connection to the Bay Area. And I really believe, just because I happened to hear it a couple weeks ago on the radio, the 1949 recording of Boogie Children, that
Oh, wow.
I was like, this is rock and roll, this is rock and roll. Now, a lot of people would say, okay, well, then 1951, we have Ike Turner and, Rocket 88, and it has, that feel. I mean, I don't know. I would like to start with John Lee Hooker, and I would like to continue the thread because we know that as time went on, he was beloved by the so-called, mainstream rock and rollers, the classic rock people, right? And he
Right.
was extremely influential. My point is that I don't think that he gets his due as an original. Now, fast forward a little bit to 1955 when Chuck Berry comes out with Maybelline and Bo Diddley comes out with Bo Diddley, and you say, well, okay, that's where rock and roll is born. Okay, fine, fair enough. Chuck Berry gets his nickname, the father of rock and roll. Bo Diddley's the originator. They can battle it out. I don't care because they're both great, as is Little Richard, as is Fats Domino.
Right.
How are we going to, Fats Domino was in way early with the
Yes.
Fat Man. So how can we really say when and where and how? That's why I just say, let's just go with John Lee Hooker. It's 1949. And then the 50s come on. And I think it's like, I love John Lee because, he has a Bay Area connection, and I got to see him, one of the living bluesmen that I got to see on a frequent basis. And that we know that some of our other local folks, Carlos Santana, for example, loved John Lee. He also liked Miles Davis. And I would be really remiss if I didn't say that jazz had a huge impact on rock and roll. I mean, Chuck Berry loved Charlie Christian, and we know this to be true, that rock and roll would not exist without jazz either. So it's just, I am by no means an expert on rock and roll. I do, though, like to go into these hidden corners and try to pull the threads together and open the doors for other people to go through for further exploration. So I can tell you all this kind of surface knowledge, but I can't tell you the actual date, time, and place of the recording. I mean, I can in my writing when I'm doing the research, but my brain, my brain doesn't fire that way. But what I can tell you is that I know that there are too many unheralded heroes and sheroes of rock and roll. Please, let's not get going on, Sister Rosetta Tharpe and the blues women, Memphis Minnie, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith. I mean, these women informed the rock and roll writing style, the delivery, the content of the songs. So, we must never speak these other names without mentioning them. And then as time goes on, I mean, I could just go on, Thomas. It's crazy. The Isley Brothers, the Parliaments. I mean, what the heck? Just, I mean, one does not exist without the other.
Correct.
We're all in this stew. And that is one of the great things, that the tale of rock and roll has been told and told and told from all these different angles. And I think it's incumbent on the newer historians, the people coming up, to take a look again at these often undercovered and underreported angles. We know the business was crooked, okay?
Yes.
We have heard of the scandals. We have heard of the ripoffs. But have we really investigated the lives of, say, the songwriters without whom the music would not have been made? The Otis Blackwells of the world, who wrote the songs mostly that Elvis Presley sang. What about Arthur Alexander? These names don't exactly roll off the tongues of young rock and roll fans. My argument is they should know these names, because this is what the birth of rock and roll was about. These people who were toiling with a pen and paper to write songs that, again, transcend time and category. You look at the list of some of these songs that people wrote, whatever it was, Fever, the Otis Blackwell song, Fever, recorded by Little Willie John and Peggy Lee, most famously, right? But what do you know about Otis Blackwell? That's just one example, right?
This is why this is why I have this podcast. It's a passion project for me. And what I hope it does is introduce people to this whole idea of, digging deeper into music, and not be monomusical, but embrace all the music that's out there, whether it be categorized or just, no label on it at all. But I appreciate you going through this and sharing that, because it's very key to the podcast to be able to say, okay, these are individuals that you might want to research and go back and find out a little bit more about them.
Yeah. I mean, Detroit is such an important part on the map of American music, right? I mean, we know that. And, you have some great examples of Black innovation and business success. I don't have to, state the obvious, probably Motown.
Right.
But how many other things were happening in Detroit? You could probably name a bunch. I could name a bunch. And interestingly, they're all kind of like far out, kind of like really edgy things, whether we're talking about rock and roll or kind of just progressive thought, and then just dance music and good time stuff that was happening on Hastings Street, the kind that, John Lee Hooker cataloged in his song. So it's a place, the history is just so deep that, scholars have been and will be studying it for years. My point was, oh yeah, all the Motown songwriters, and then all of the singers who didn't make it onto that roster, but recorded for the myriad of other labels and
Right.
concerns that
Right.
existed in the
Yeah.
area, right? So, yeah, sure, the world has heard about Motown, but you know that there's so much more beneath that surface. And
Yeah. One of the things I learned about Motown in the process of doing these shows is that they had a country label. I did
wow,
not know they had a country label. I was blown away when one of my guests had told me that.
that's really interesting. And, my interest, aside from, all of the, boy, the unbelievable contribution to American music made by Motown, I love all of it. But I have a special interest in the Black Forum label, which released spoken word recordings and poetry, speeches and poetry,
Oh,
and
okay.
and politically motivated uh, recordings. So that's interesting too. Not available so much anymore. You really have to search that stuff out, but it's there to be found, and I love
All right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what do you see as globally? What do you see with rock and roll? Because every country has their take on a particular genre of music. Japan, Russia.
Hmm.
Um, you know, what are your thoughts on the future of rock and roll globally?
Wow. Well, one thing that I think that is pretty exciting is the reclaiming of rock and roll by young African American musicians, whether they're Afro punk or more directed toward Afro futurism. There's certainly a strain of jazz and fusion artistry coming back. I don't know if you remember, but fusion kind of got a bad name, back in the day. Well, now coming back in a big way, in a good way. So artists are embracing jazz and rock, which is, I think, a wonderful trend. As far as other countries, with the emergence of digital recording, we've been able to hear such a wide spectrum of music from around the world, and I've had the chance to hear rock music from India, rock music from Cambodia, and it's interesting. There is a language barrier often, so that can be an impediment to enjoying it. Globally, I can't rightly say what's going on in the world of rock music. People have been proclaiming that rock has been dead for a really long time and that it might come back. I
Well,
would argue that
no, I was going to say they say the same thing about jazz, though. So,
that's true. That's true. And, yeah, the argument is that, but I don't think that great music ever goes away. And do we need more music? Well, if it's great, yes. But if it's mediocre or less than, probably not. But, rock and roll, it used to provide a sense of community for people who felt that they were on the outside of society. And then it became something else. It was co-opted, commodified, mainstreamed, and the thing that happens often to art. I think that we have moved beyond the binary of the black and white, categories, the rock and roll. I think that it's time to just look at the full spectrum of music and accept that there are all different gradations along the way. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's healthy. We don't need the categories. We probably never did. And
I agree. However, I think that it's just listeners who appreciate that, not radio, and definitely not in the music industry. I mean, because
no,
they can't figure out a way to market music without having their labels.
yeah, that's exactly, if we were to go back to the beginning of rock and roll, you
Mm.
can you can see what happened. In the late 50s, rock and roll kind of died out. It crazy, right? It's just invented and is picking up steam, and then it kind of drifts away. Why is that? Oh, well, some people go in the army, others are under arrest, others want to retreat into gospel music, so it kind of goes away. And this is when the so-called powers that be, the industry machine, decides, oh, I know what we can do. We can take this black invention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can now put a white face on it and sell it to the mainstream. Okay, that worked for a minute or two, but because people just weren't having it. That was not the spirit of rock and roll. So the civil rights movement at that point is on, and people want to come together. Like you said, the people don't want this stratification. People want to find unity and harmony, and we found it for a time on the airwaves, on the dance floor, at the venues where live music was being played by Black folks, white folks, brown folks. It was for everyone, as it
Right.
should be, you know. And it's just the business, like you said, that got in the way. We were talking before the show started about today's loss of Charlie Watts, the drummer from the Rolling Stones. And it is a sad day for rock music fans, and rightfully so. He was a great drummer. His fellow musicians were astounded by his ability to keep time and bring a certain feel that was identifiable only as the Rolling Stones
He
sound.
was my favorite member.
Absolutely, right? And why is that probably? Well, probably, and he would be the first to tell you that jazz was his first love.
Yes, yes,
He
yes.
was trained in that tradition, and he modeled himself on the greatest players of all time, Elvin Jones, Art Blakey. He loved the music of Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis again. Miles just comes up. I'm sure someday he'll just have a show on Miles and the influence and how he touched every type of music, right? But back to
Right.
Charlie Watts. He was always promoting jazz as a member of the Rolling Stones. I mean, not everybody would hear that, see that, acknowledge it, but that was the underpinning. That was at the foundation. So when you ask me about worldwide rock and roll community or fellowship, it's people like that. An Englishman who wants to let the world know that American music, the traditional American culture that is African American made, jazz, blues, gospel, that's what gave us rock and roll.
Mm.
If it were not for, then what? Nothing. That
Good point.
is our culture.
Yep.
American culture is Black culture. And the more white folks can get behind that, the may the truth be told. But America isn't great about reporting its history accurately. And I think other parts of the world have gotten hip to that sooner
Right.
than we have.
Yeah, one of the biggest things as a country we do is export music, whether it
Right.
be techno or house or soul or funk or, as you say, jazz or
Yeah.
country. But we export music and we do it well.
The business of music. Yeah. And
Mm.
and getting back to the the making of music, the joy of creation and witnessing the and hearing, people in the throes of their creativity that we get to enjoy via recorded music, live concerts, now courtesy of YouTube and these great vintage videos and recordings that we all get to share. I mean, it's kind of a miracle when you think of it. If I could have accessed these YouTube clips, when I was a kid, I would be more knowledgeable about the music than I am, I guess.
Oh yeah, you and I both. I mean, I find myself going down that rabbit hole so much, and I have to
Yeah.
dig myself out. It's just unbelievable, all the history that's out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
In regards to artists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one thing, I know that I've probably talked way too much, but one more word on Charlie Watts. I had heard something that he said. People didn't understand how he could get so into like avant-garde jazz, the music, say, of Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and he said something to the effect of, "Well, it sounds good. I like it. What more do we need to know than that?"
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, were you able to put together a list for our listeners to maybe to introduce them to early days of rock and roll?
Well, that was one direction that I neglected to follow, but I could I could do
Off the
it.
top of your head.
Yeah, I could do it off the top of my head. And maybe, everybody that I mentioned today is probably worth a listen. One person that I really wanted to note, of course, was Etta James. She was a great blues singer. And that's how she was identified often, as a blues singer who, of course, profoundly influenced rock and roll singers, chiefly Janis Joplin, right? Etta James, because she came up in that world of chess records and the male-dominated sessions that took place there. I think Etta James does not really get her due, and she worked long and hard throughout her whole life.
Now,
So
is it possible she didn't get her due because she was not classified, but she was, jazz and gospel and
I think, blues. I think blues artists really have gotten the short shrift. Because they didn't have that marketing machinery so much behind them, and the circuit that they played, it was not as highly financed, and for all kinds of reasons. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, but I am a big fan of Little Richard. We lost him in 2020, and he was working, on and off in his later years. But, the giants, what would we call them? Kind of like the big four. I go for Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard. And Little Richard is the one. Obviously, he was a big influence on the Beatles, bringing in all the different styles, from the South, from New Orleans, St. Louis. These are all like the hot spots on the map of rock and roll. Later on, we get into New York and Los Angeles, but so we talked a little bit about the blues women. There's a great book by Angela Davis that takes on the stories of the blues women, and in particular, Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Memphis Minnie, who we talked about, really foundational to the kind of later blues rock and forms that we're talking about. You have the girl groups, Phil Spector Productions, the Ronettes, Darlene Love, who was, of course, a great vocalist on a lot of those records, often going by the name The Crystals.
Yep, the
Um,
Crystals, yeah.
yeah, a great vocalist. Later, we talked about the Rolling Stones. Vocalists like Mary Clayton and Claudia Lanier. I know that we're going forward in time, but that's the nature of these timelines. You have to go forward to go back. We didn't say a thing about background vocals, but what would rock and roll be without the vocalists, the secret weapons in the studio, the side musicians, the background vocalists. I
Right.
would just encourage people to listen closely, to read as much as you can in the notes, whether they're online or in books. Of course, we like to encourage people to read books about rock and roll. If something strikes you, dig a little deeper, see what's behind the curtain, because that is where I think the real juice is. That's where you're going to find the good stuff. It's not just what you see on the screen. You have to, as you said, go down the rabbit hole, and you'll find something that maybe your friends haven't heard of and you certainly haven't heard of, but discovery is part of the deal. We just
Yeah.
don't accept what's offered to us. Go out and find some of your own, and if you have the talent, make some of your own music.
Right. Yeah, being open-minded when it comes to music, that's the key.
Absolutely. I mean, I think of all the wonderful things that have come our way just in my lifetime. I mean, I feel so blessed, really, to have been able to interview some of these people in the course of my work. Some of the greats of music, and to have just been on Earth in their time. To witness these performances, whether they were recorded or live, and to just know that great artists were among us. I mean, they really do make the world go round. I do believe that art and music has the power and ability to make positive change. One of my favorite artists ever of all time. You don't know. I'm I don't know that you could guess who it is, but
Well, but there's one person you never mentioned. Can I try to guess?
please.
Is it Prince?
Oh my gosh. Well, Prince, I could tell stories about Prince for days, but it's Bob Marley, actually.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, I know. And why is that? Well, like Prince and like so many others, but let's just stick with Bob Marley. I did see Prince on his first time to San Francisco. That is burned into my memory. Actually, what's burned into my memory is the day that I was watching American Bandstand on a Saturday morning, in my parents' home, and Prince was the guest artist on American Bandstand. Now, this is the kind of thing, American Bandstand, Dick Clark, for better or worse, Saturday mornings, you'd be watching it, there'd be all kinds of this or that, and then Prince. And then life changes in an instant, you know?
Right.
It's just boom, that's it. Okay, got to know everything about Prince, got to get well, at that time, I guess there was like one or two records when he made his debut there, but it was like, got to know everything about Prince.
Yeah. Well, the
And
reason I kind of dropped his name like that because I was thinking he was from I guess my generation, your generation. He was a guy who was trying to not be placed in a box musically.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So I was thinking he would be the person that was,
well, that's it for sure. And
hmm
and and another thing about Prince is that he was an artist advocate. And he also wanted people to know their history. So he would pay homage to people who came before him, and he would
yes,
help promote people that would live after him. So he kind of had it all. And as for Bob Marley, I would say that he was similar in that he wanted to bring people together. He was a great unifying force. He bridged that gap, or the audiences with punk rock, the punky reggae party, and it's all right. Rastaman vibration is positive. Every little thing's going to be all right. I mean, if you're looking for positive message music, Bob Marley is the guy. Calypso music, reggae music is some of the strongest message music that you'll ever hear on the planet. That said, it is also some of the happiest making music. I put it on, much like the blues, I would like to add. I put on a Bob Marley record and I put on a Mighty Sparrow record. I instantly feel happy. And they can be talking about very serious issues. Of course, most of the time they are. But the spirit of hope that's threaded throughout is what I'm hearing, what I love about it. The blues also works magically in that way. Of course, we know what it means to have the blues. But if you've ever listened to somebody like Furry Lewis, who is a great example of the blues bringing happiness to anybody who hears it. I mean, I can't think of a better example. And Furry Lewis lived in Memphis in our time, and many rock and roll people were fortunate to have worked with him and see him live. The Rolling Stones among them. So, when we're talking about Prince, yeah, this same spirit, we could call it rock and roll spirit. It's definitely a spirit that flows through all these musics.
So what do you
great.
have in the hopper now? What are you working on?
I just wrapped up a project for the Bob Dylan archive, and I was asked to write about the civil rights era and Bob Dylan's contribution, and that of one of his friends and colleagues from the Greenwich Village days, a songwriter named Len Chandler. Most people don't know the name Len Chandler, but he was third in a trio that included Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and himself, Len Chandler. If you watch any footage of the March on Washington, you will see the three of them there performing. And little is known about Len Chandler, but I interviewed him several times. And he told me the story of collaborating and learning how to write songs more accurately with Bob Dylan when they were young men in Greenwich Village. And this is the exact kind of history that I love chasing down and uncovering. And again, Len Chandler, a folk singer and unheralded movement worker during the civil rights movement, who actually went to register voters in Mississippi at great risk to himself, as did all the freedom riders at that time. And this is an issue, of course, that is as timely today as it was in the early 60s. So I don't veer too far from the general course that I like to stay on, which is music and intersections with social justice. But when I get a chance to go and take a deep dive into something like that, I jump on it, because research is one of my favorite parts of the job. And more than that, talking to folks and combining it with the soundtrack of the music of their lives and our lives, and projecting, a full picture of our times, these extraordinary times that we lived through the late 20th century and the early 21st century. I don't think that historians will really be able to believe what we lived through when they look back at us. It's kind of mind-boggling in a way. So I'm writing it for the readers of the future, and that's who I have my eye on now.
Well, thank you, Denise
Thank you,
Sullivan,
Thomas. It was really a
for
pleasure.
sharing all of that.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Well, I hope the episode moved you to want to research further the origins of rock and roll. Denise Sullivan is an example of why I'm passionate about having these conversations about different genres of music. Her insight, her writing about music and the connection socially. Her passion is contagious. I like the idea of moving the rock and roll timeline before Chuck Berry came on the scene to 1948 with John Lee Hooker. Denise was disappointed that she was unable to provide her list during our conversation, so here is her suggested listening. Boogie Chilling, John Lee Hooker, 1948. The Fat Man, Fats Domino, 1950. Hound Dog, Big Mama Thornton, 1953. Wallflower, Rolling With Me Henry, Etta James, 1955. Too Much Monkey Business, Chuck Berry, 1957. Keep It Knockin', Little Richard, 1957. Who Do You Love, Bo Diddley, 1957. Shout, Isley Brothers, 1959. Fool in Love, Ike and Tina Turner, 1960. The Locomotion, Little Eva, 1962. She also wanted to apologize for not mentioning Sylvia Robinson, yes, the mother of hip-hop, Norma Jean Wolford, aka the Duchess, both performed with Bo Diddley, Tina Turner, Barbara Lynn, Ray Charles, Willie Dixon, and Howlin' Wolf, to name just a few. Please be sure to shop for Denise Sullivan's books at independent bookstores, bookshop.org, or on her website, denisesullivan.com. As always, please share the link to this episode and your favorite episode with someone who wants to learn interesting facts about the music they listen to and to expand their playlist. They can listen directly from my website at meetthemusic.buzzsprout.com or wherever they get their podcasts. If this was your first episode, be sure to listen to our most downloaded episode on Zydeco with Michael Tesseran, or our other episode, Moving Up the Charts with Dr. Raylan Rabaka on rap and hip hop culture. Thank you for joining us in our musical journey.